Picture a man standing barefoot in the dust of an Attic field in the spring of 595 BC. He is perhaps 40 years old. His tunic is stained with the iron-red soil of the hills outside Athens. At his feet sits a small heap of grain, by some estimates, no more than a few medimnoi, a measure that would barely feed a family through a single bad winter. And because of that grain, because of a debt of a few measures owed to a wealthier neighbor, this man is about to be loaded onto a ship at the port of Phaleron and sold across the sea. His wife, his children, himself, all of them in chains for a quantity of barley that could be carried in 2 arms. This is not a parable. This is, according to the ancient sources, a scene that played out across the countryside of Attica on a scale that historians still struggle to estimate. And it is the opening scene, the cold, hard opening scene of what may be the first documented sovereign debt crisis in recorded Western history. Now hold that image, because something stranger is true about it than the cruelty itself. Greece, the cradle of democracy, the supposed birthplace of the rational citizen, the civilization that gave us the very word polis, and with it, the idea that a community of free men could govern themselves. Greece invented the sovereign debt crisis at the same time it invented the polis. The two ideas, the free citizen and the financial implosion, grew up together. They were twins, and from the very first generation of recorded Greek political thought, the great unsolved problem was not tyranny, not invasion, not plague. It was debt. Who owed it? Who held it? And what happened when ordinary people could no longer pay? That story begins in a place and a century that most modern viewers have never been asked to picture clearly. So let us go there. The Attica of the late 7th century BC was not yet the marble Athens of Pericles. It was a rough peninsula of olive groves and barley fields, dotted with farmsteads, threaded by goat paths, ringed by hills that turned bone white in the summer sun. The city of Athens itself was a modest cluster of buildings around the Acropolis, important regionally but not yet the cultural superpower it would become. Most of the population lived on the land. They were farmers, they were potters, they were shepherds, and the social order around them was shifting in ways that almost nobody at the time fully understood. Coinage was just beginning to spread through the Aegean world. The first true coins, struck in Electrum, had appeared in Lydia in Asia Minor only a generation or two earlier. By the late 7th century, the idea was beginning to leak westward. Small, standardized lumps of precious metal that could be counted, hoarded, lent. Before coinage, debt in agricultural Attica had been a sticky local thing. You owed your neighbor a measure of grain. He owed your cousin a goat. The web was small. It was personal. It could be argued and renegotiated around a table. Coinage changed that. Coinage made debt portable. It made it impersonal. It made it scalable. A wealthy aristocrat could now extend loans across an entire valley, and the obligations would not blur into the social fabric. They would sit there, in ledgers and in memory, hard-edged as a struck silver disc. And in this shifting landscape, a system had taken root in Attica that the Greek historians called the system of the hectomoroi. The word means, roughly, sixth parters. The hectomoroi were Athenian farmers who worked land they did not fully own, or who owed a perpetual sixth of their harvest to a wealthier landholder. The exact legal mechanics are debated even today, 2.5 millennia later. Some scholars argue the hectomoroi were tenant farmers paying a fixed rent. Others argue they were debtors paying off perpetual obligations. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC about events nearly 300 years before, his time suggested the system was a kind of crushing serfdom dressed in the language of credit. What is clear is this: A small number of aristocratic families in Attica had, across generations, accumulated land and accumulated claims on the labor of their poorer neighbors. The small farmer, hit by a single bad harvest, would borrow grain to plant the next year's crop. If that crop failed too, the debt would compound. The interest, in a world without banking regulations or usury laws, could be brutal. And under the customary law of the time, a free Athenian citizen could pledge his own body, his own person, as collateral. Let that sit for a moment. A free man could pledge himself, which meant that if he defaulted, he could be seized. He could be sold, he could be shipped abroad, his children with him. This was not an abstract risk. By the early 6th century BC, according to the surviving sources, this was happening at a scale that was beginning to hollow out the Athenian middle class, to the extent that there was anything we would recognize as a middle class at all. Plutarch, writing centuries later but drawing on older traditions, describes a countryside dotted with stone markers, the horoi, slabs of inscribed rock planted in fields to indicate that the land was mortgaged, to a creditor, to an aristocratic family, to a faceless claim that would never go away. The horoi were the ancient version of the foreclosure sign. Imagine driving through a modern suburb and seeing one out of every 3 lawns staked with a bank notice. That is roughly the texture of Attica in the years leading up to 594 BC. Stone after stone after stone, marble pale in the summer light, each one a small monument to a family's slow drowning, and then, in trickles at first, and then, in steady streams, the Athenians themselves began to disappear, sold across the sea, to Aegina, to Corinth, to the slave markets of the wider Mediterranean. Citizens of a Greek polis, men who in theory belonged to the political community of Athens, ending their lives breaking rocks on a foreign island or rowing the bench of a foreign galley. There are no reliable census figures for how many. The ancient sources speak in the rhetoric of catastrophe rather than statistics. But the political pressure inside Athens itself became unbearable. The poor were arming, the rich were barricading. Civil war, the Greek historians say, was a heartbeat away. It is worth pausing here, pausing on the strangeness of this, because at this exact moment in time, in this exact place, a thought was forming in the Greek mind that would echo across 26 centuries. The thought was this: a community cannot survive if its own members are being sold into slavery by its own laws. There is something wrong with a legal order that lets a free citizen become the property of his neighbor over a measure of grain. The contract may be valid, the interest may have been agreed, the seizure may be technically lawful, and yet, if the result is the destruction of the political community itself, then the law must yield. This thought was radical in 594 BC. In some ways, it is still radical today, and it brings us by a strange and almost unbearable echo to a square in modern Athens in the spring of 2010. Syntagma Square, the 30-foot Greek flag snapping in the wind off the Aegean. Tear gas drifting between the orange trees. Crowds chanting against the IMF, against the European Central Bank, against the German Chancellor's photograph being burned in effigy. Greece, the sovereign nation, had run aground on a mountain of debt. Sovereign bonds, bank exposures, accumulated deficits that no future tax base could realistically service. The terms being offered to keep Greek banks solvent were brutal. Pension cuts, wage cuts, mass layoffs, fire sale privatizations, a haircut on private bondholders that was eventually imposed in 2012 at terms that wiped out a substantial portion of the face value of restructured Greek debt. And in those streets, in those years between 2010 and roughly 2018, when the third bailout program formally ended, you could hear the same word being shouted that had been shouted in the Athenian Agora in 594 BC. The word was kreokopia. It means in Greek, debt cancellation, or, more literally, the cutting of debt. It is a word with a very, very old pedigree in the Greek language, and the men shouting it in 2010 were, knowingly or not, invoking a memory that ran straight back to the man who, in 594 BC, was about to do something no Greek leader had ever done before. His name was Solon. Solon was, by the standards of his own class, an unlikely figure. He came from an aristocratic family, but had spent his earlier life as a merchant, traveling, trading, observing other Greek cities and the foreign powers around the Aegean. He was a poet as well as a politician. Fragments of his verse survive, and they read like the words of a man who has thought carefully and bitterly about the moral economics of his own city. He was elected to the archonship, the chief magistracy of Athens, in the year 594 BC. He was given, according to the sources, extraordinary powers, the authority to rewrite the laws of Athens from the ground up, and he used those powers in a way that no one quite expected. What Solon did was called the seisachtheia. The word is one of those Greek compounds that the language assembles like a piece of architecture. It means, roughly, the shaking off of burdens. And it was not a vague gesture. It was not, as it is sometimes summarized, a foggy, Solon forgave the debts. It was a concrete legal and economic program with at least 4 distinct components, and each one is worth understanding. First, debt cancellation. Existing debt secured against the persons or the land of Athenian citizens were, by decree, dissolved. The horoi, the mortgage stones, were physically uprooted from the fields and the hills. Plutarch describes Solon, late in life, taking pride in the memory of those stones being pulled from the earth, that the dark soil of Attica had been freed from its inscribed slabs. Second, the prohibition of debt slavery. From that moment forward, no Athenian citizen could be enslaved for failure to pay a debt. The body of the free man was, by law, removed from the universe of possible collateral. This was not a moral suggestion. It was a hard legal line written into the new code of the city. Third, repatriation. Athenians who had already been sold abroad as slaves were, where they could be found, bought back at public expense and returned to the city. Solon's own poetry refers to this, the bringing home of citizens who had forgotten how to speak Attic Greek, who had picked up the accents of foreign masters in foreign lands. Estimates of how many were actually recovered are uncertain, and ancient sources tend toward the rhetorical rather than the precise. Fourth, and this is the part most often forgotten in modern summaries, currency reform. Solon is credited by some ancient sources with adjusting the weight standard of the Athenian drachma, making the coin somewhat lighter, which had the practical effect of making existing debts denominated in drachmas easier to repay in real terms. Some modern historians are skeptical of the details, arguing that the Athenian coinage was still in its infancy, and that the reform may have been more about weights and measures than about coins as we would recognize them. But the underlying principle is what matters. Solon understood, as the central banks of our own century understand, that the unit of account itself is a lever, that you can ease a debt crisis not only by canceling debts directly, but by quietly adjusting the value of the medium in which those debts are owed. The backlash was immediate. The aristocratic creditors who had seen their claims dissolved were furious. The poorest of the poor were also disappointed. They had expected, some of them, a full redistribution of the land, not merely the cancellation of their debts. Solon, in his own poetry, describes himself as standing between 2 armies with a shield, protecting each from the other and being hated by both. He left Athens shortly afterward, traveling abroad for 10 years, partly to let his reforms settle without his presence becoming a flashpoint. And here it is worth pausing for one quote, one line, paraphrased from the fragments of Solon's own verse that survive to us. He wrote, in essence, that he had given to the people as much power as was sufficient, not too little, not too much, and that he had also taken care that the powerful and the wealthy should suffer no indignity. The deepest political question of his reform was the question of balance, not the destruction of the creditor class, not the elevation of the poor into a new ruling class, but the preservation of the polis itself as something larger than the sum of its debts. That is the part the modern ear sometimes misses. Solon did not abolish wealth. He did not abolish property. He did not even abolish lending. What he abolished was the specific mechanism by which the wealth of a few could absorb the persons of the many. He drew a line under what a debt could do, and in drawing that line, he made the Athenian polis possible. Without the Syzochtheia, there would have been no Athenian 5th century, no Themistocles at Salamis, no Pericles, no Sophocles, no Aristotle. The cultural explosion that we now think of as classical Greece sits, in a very direct sense, on the foundation of a debt cancellation carried out by a poet-politician in 594 BC. But the story does not end there. Because the strange thing about Greek financial history, and this is one of the great rhymes in the historical record, is that the debt problem did not stay solved. Less than 2 centuries later, in the second half of the 4th century BC, Athens faced another financial crisis of a very different shape. The currency of Athens, by then, the famous silver tetradrachm with its owl reverse, one of the most trusted coinages in the Mediterranean, had become the target of widespread counterfeiting. Plated coins, silver-washed bronze cores, debased imitations from foreign mints were flooding the Attic markets. Merchants did not know whether the coin in their hand was good metal or trash, and the entire commercial life of the city, built on the credibility of that silver owl, was starting to wobble. The Athenian response in the year 375 or 374 BC, depending on the source you consult, was the Nikophon Decree. The decree, which survives in a remarkably intact inscription discovered in the Athenian Agora in the 20th century, established a public testing system for coins. An official slave, a dokimastes, a coin tester, was stationed at the marketplace and at the port. Any coin offered in payment could be required to be inspected. Good coins were stamped and returned. Bad coins were confiscated. The decree set out the procedures, the penalties, the chain of responsibility in a level of detail that any modern financial regulator would recognize. This was not a debt crisis in the Solonian sense, but it was a monetary crisis. It was a crisis of trust in the unit of account. And the Athenian solution was, in essence, the creation of a public regulatory function, a state-backed verification mechanism standing between private actors and the currency they exchanged. If the Syzochtheia of 594 BC is the ancient ancestor of modern debt restructuring, the Nikophon Decree of 375 is the ancient ancestor of modern financial regulation. The Greeks faced, in slow motion across 2 centuries, the same 2 great categories of monetary trouble that the modern world still faces today: too much debt, and a currency in which trust has frayed. And both times, the Greek response was the same in its basic shape: identify the failure, draw a public line, use the authority of the polis to intervene in the private contracts of citizens in defense of the polis itself. The aftermath of these reforms, taken together, is one of the longer threads in Western political thought. The Greeks went on, in subsequent centuries, to suffer further financial troubles. There were the disastrous costs of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens drained the Delian League treasury, funds originally raised for collective defense against Persia, gradually repurposed for Athenian imperial spending in a way that historians have argued amounted to a slow-motion sovereign default on the implicit promises made to allied cities. There were the state borrowings from temple treasuries. There were the silver coinages debased and restored. There were the loans from Macedonian and Persian kings that came with political strings attached. But the principle of the seisachtheia, the principle that there are some private contracts that the political community cannot allow to consume the political community itself, that principle did not die. It became one of the foundations of Western civic identity. The Romans, centuries later, wrestling with their own debt crises in the late Republic, would echo it in confused and partial ways. Medieval and early modern jurists, picking through the inheritance of Greek and Roman law, would return to it again and again. Debt jubilees in religious traditions, bankruptcy law in early modern Europe, the entire apparatus of sovereign debt, restructuring in our own century. All of it carries, somewhere in its DNA, the genetic material of what Solon did in 594 BC. There is something strange about that, something almost warm if you sit with it. The oldest civilizations keep teaching the newest the same lesson, over and over, like a patient grandparent telling a story whose ending the children always forget. The Greeks figured out, in the early 6th century BC, that a society which lets its citizens be devoured by their own debts will not survive. And every few generations since, somebody somewhere has had to learn it again. Slowly, painfully, usually after the smoke is already in the air. Which brings us, finally, to the present. It is the spring of 2026. The global debt picture, by the figures of major international institutions, sits at levels that the world has never sustained in peacetime. The United States national debt has crossed $34 trillion and continues to climb. The U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio is at levels not seen since the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Japan, the largest holder of its own sovereign paper, sits at a debt-to-GDP ratio in excess of 250%, a number that would have been considered unthinkable a generation ago. The Eurozone, scarred by the Greek crisis that began in 2010, and the Italian wobbles that have come and gone since, remains structurally fragile. A currency union without a unified fiscal authority, a Solonian polis without a Solon. The post-pandemic borrowing of 2020 through 2022 piled fresh debt onto already strained sovereign balance sheets across the developed world. The interest rate cycle that followed has made that debt more expensive to service. The political appetite in most major democracies for either large tax increases or substantial spending cuts is roughly non-existent, which means the debt continues to compound. Quietly, the way the debts of the Attic farmers compounded under the hectomoroi system, slowly, sticky, until one day they are not slow and not sticky. And the question of what to do about them becomes the only question in the room. Nobody knows, with any confidence, how the modern story ends. There are several possible shapes that a 21st century seisachtheia could take. It could come as inflation, a slow, deliberate erosion of the real value of debts owed in fiat currency, which is, in essence, what Solon may have done with his weight standard reform, just done across decades rather than in a single decree. It could come as yield curve control, where central banks cap the cost of sovereign borrowing by purchasing bonds at scale, which keeps the system functional but transfers the cost in subtle ways onto savers and pensioners. It could come as outright restructuring, the way Greek private bondholders were restructured in 2012. Write-downs, term extensions, conversions. Or it could come, as some economists fear, in a more disorderly form, with sovereign defaults rippling across emerging markets and into developed ones. None of these outcomes are predictions. None of them should be read as advice. The honest answer is that the global financial system is in a state that resembles, in some uncomfortable ways, the Attica of the late 7th century BC. Debts have piled up. The mortgage stones, modern, electronic, abstract, are multiplying across the landscape. The political pressure is rising, and somewhere, in some quiet office, in Washington or Frankfurt or Tokyo, there may already be people sketching out, in spreadsheets and policy papers, the shape of what a modern shaking off of burdens might look like. What we can say, with the confidence of the historical record, is that this has happened before, many times, beginning with a man named Solon in the year 594 BC, walking out into a countryside scattered with stone markers and ordering them pulled from the earth. The question that hangs over our own century is whether we will find our own Solon in time, or whether, like other societies that have stood on the edge of a debt cliff and looked down, we will go over the edge first and reform only on the way back up. That is not a question that this video can answer. It may not be a question that anyone can answer until the answer is already written into history and we are reading it backwards. But it is a question worth carrying with you. Into the next news cycle, into the next political season, into the next quiet conversation with someone who thinks the markets always rise and the debts always roll. The Greeks figured this out a long time ago. They figured out that a polis is more than the sum of its contracts. They figured out that a free citizen is not the same thing as a piece of collateral. They figured out that sometimes the only way to save a society is to draw a line through some part of what is owed. Whether the modern world remembers that lesson or has to learn it again the hard way is still being decided. In the meantime, the marble of the old Attic Heroi sits in museums in Athens and around the world, weathered and silent, waiting for a generation that might finally be ready to read what is written on them. If this thread interests you, if the long shape of debt and reform across the centuries is something you want to follow further, there is more of this story to walk through. Other empires, other crises, other moments when the burdens grew too heavy and someone somewhere had to decide whether the contract or the community would prevail. Stay with the channel for the next one, and in the meantime, keep watching the Heroi of your own age. They are not made of stone anymore, but they are still being planted one by one in the soil of the modern world.